Figure it out.
Hello, this is Adam Koralik with Figure It Out Productions. The following video is part of our Quick Shoot series.
Hey guys, it's Adam here, and welcome to part 6 of my 5th video game generation retrospective. Of course, today we'll be talking about the Sony Playstation. Now, like you, I too really think of the 5th video game generation as the PlayStation versus the N64, and to a lesser extent, the Sega Saturn. Even I say that as a die-hard Sega fanatic. But there were a lot of other consoles in that generation. I've done videos on them before, which I recommend you see before watching this. But in short, there were like a bunch of them. I think there was a grand total of 9. Now, how is that possible? How is it that now we have like 3, sometimes we had 2? Why did we have 9? My theory on that goes back to the 4th generation and the success that the Sega Genesis had, proving to the world that you didn't have to be Nintendo to make a lot of money making video game hardware. And so a bunch of these other companies all had ideas. They all said, all right, you know what? There's room for another guy in there. I want to do it. I want to try. And they all tried. They all had their little strategies and they had their little plans. And none of them really worked out, except, of course, for Sony and their PlayStation. Now, how? How did that happen? Why did that one specifically take off instead of, say, oh, I don't know, the Commodore's Amiga CD32? Today I want to talk about some of the reasons this console exploded into the successful juggernaut that it was. We have to go back to the 4th generation. We have to think about when Sega was fighting Nintendo with the Super Nintendo. It was pretty well agreed that regardless of where you stood, the Genesis was not quite as powerful as the Super Nintendo. I mean, that made sense. They were 2 years apart from each other as far as their construction. So in an effort for Sega to compete with that and finally push themselves over the hump and beat Nintendo, they released the Sega Cd. Yes, that Sega Cd was the intended device to get Sega to win that console war. Now, we may think of that as silly now, but at the time it legitimately made sense. The Sega Cd, while we associate it with like FMV games, has a lot of extra horsepower in it that the Genesis could have used. I mean, well, at least the Sega CD portion of it could have used to really compete with the Super Nintendo on a more technical level. Nintendo saw this as a legitimate threat and decided to act appropriately. What they did was they actually started investing in their own CD add-on. This would ultimately be known as the PlayStation. Now, they approached Sony about this and said, like, we want to make this add-on, what do you guys want to do it? And they said, yeah, well, you know, sure, we'll do it. So they came up with a deal together, and this thing got all the way to the point where it was at prototype stage. And actually, Sony unveiled their PlayStation. But Nintendo had only shortly before that realized that the deal they had made with Sony was actually a very bad deal for them. Because what it meant was that all software sales that came from the CD add-on, Nintendo wouldn't see any money out of, or at least virtually no money out of. So Nintendo actually had no reason to proceed forward with the deal. They actually thought, wait a minute, we're letting them just kind of attach themselves to our popular machine and they make all the money. You might see additional hardware sales, but really that's it. And at the same time, you're kind of locked into making games for this machine that you're seeing no money out of. There was no real reason for Nintendo to keep that deal. So Nintendo, in a very shady move, kind of announced at the same game show that they had actually decided to partner up with Philips, which was Sony's immediate technological competitor, and said, hey, we're going to be working with Philips now. Fuck you guys at Sony. See ya. Bye. Even after Sony had already talked about their device. Now, Sony was very pissed off about that and said, all right, you're going to work with our main competitor, then we're going to work with yours. Believe it or not, Sony actually did a lot to back up the Sega CD once it was already out there. They actually put a lot of games out there. The most infamous one, I think, is Super Shark, or at least it's the most well-known one. Yeah, that's weird, right, to think that they were actually working together back then. Now, this was a huge mess between all 4 of these companies, and eventually they sat down together, and the deal they struck was that Philips would be allowed to basically go off and make its own console, which became the Philips CDI, that's how it ended up with a couple of those Nintendo games like Hotel Mario and those 3 Zelda ones. Sega would end up kind of just continuing its own path, and Nintendo would be free to go and do whatever it wanted. Sony had learned a lot about the video game industry through this whole process, and that's when obviously they decided, we're just going to make our own machine. And Sony made a lot of really right moves, and at the same time, they got lucky. They got really lucky that their competitors made a lot of really stupid moves. Now, first off, Sony had they came out with hardware that was the most powerful hardware out there. Unlike most of those other 5th gen consoles, rather than launching in like 93 or 94, they didn't come out until 95. That's a lot of additional development time to make a much more powerful machine. And on top of that, they actually came up with, I don't know if they came up with this model, but they certainly followed it beautifully. They used the model of basically giving away the shaver to sell the blades. What that means is, we all think of video game consoles as expensive, they're so pricey, they're overpriced, blah, blah, blah. Most of the time when you hear someone say that, they don't understand at all how much a console actually costs. The thing is, most hardware in consoles is sold for less than it costs the company to make it. The most infamous example is the launch version of the PlayStation 3. They sold those things for $600, and we all remember that sucking. We were like, fuck that, I don't want a PS3, 600 bucks, that's too much money, it's overpriced, blah, blah, blah. Wrong. Those things cost $900 to manufacture. Sony was willing to give you a $300 discount if you were willing to take the machine. That's how they did it. They did the same model with the PS1. I don't remember what it cost them to manufacture, but I do know that they were selling them at $299 US, which interestingly was also a full $100 cheaper than the Sega Saturn, which had come out only a few months earlier. So already they were at a good price point for much more powerful hardware as compared to the Saturn and of course everything that had come before it. So that was a good place to start. Also, they made a console that was relatively easy to develop for, unlike, again, their immediate competition was the Sega Saturn. I'm sure they saw no real threat from the previous 5th generation hardware at that point, but their software it was easy enough to make software for it. They also, you have to understand that while we associate Sony now with being like the PlayStation, like that's the thing that seems to define them these days, that's what they're known for. Back in the day, they were more known for their TVs and their Walkmans and not so much their computers, but just other electronic devices they did. So as a result, and they were actually in a much higher place profitably as a company, not PlayStation, the entire company of Sony was worth a lot more back in the day, or at least they were more profitable, I should say. And as a result, they had a lot more cash to throw at this console. So even if it wasn't doing well, they were going to be able to sit there and just keep funding it. So you had a lot of money behind it, you had easy development, and you had vastly more powerful hardware. Now what ultimately happens is, with the Sega Saturn, Sega made this machine that was so hard to develop for and nobody was buying that a lot of developers said, sorry Sega, Genesis was fun and all, but I'm going to try this PlayStation thing. And ultimately that would also happen with the Nintendo 64. Mass production of cartridges was so much more expensive than CDs, which are just little plastic discs. As a result, a lot of developers didn't want to stick with Nintendo either. They said, fuck it, we'll try this PlayStation thing. So you had a bunch of developers jumping ship, and I think the most infamous one, of course, was Square, because they were exclusively with Nintendo for up until that point, and then of course they make all the Final Fantasy VII and so on for the PlayStation. So really, you had just perfect timing and perfect series of circumstances, some they intended, some unintended, and just fuck-ups from their main competition that I think is really what birthed the PlayStation into its unbelievable success that it had. Now that being said, I have a very love-hate relationship with this console. And please do not rage, I promise I will explain myself. I love it for the gaming experiences it gave me. I had a lot of great times on there, as I'm sure a lot of you did. I will go over some of those games in a bit, and my personal experiences and when I first, all that stuff, I'll talk about it. But the thing I dislike intensely about this console is that I feel that Sony really set us down a path that we are at now, where video games has become more about patches and DLC and additional features the console is capable of, more so than it is about actual dedicated, completed, great gameplay experiences. To elaborate on that, I will go back to the 4th generation here briefly. That generation, the Super Nintendo and the Genesis, it was all about two dedicated hard game manufacturers. That was all they did was make video games. And their consoles, all they do is play games. So the only way you were ever going to beat either one of those two was to make the best games. So Nintendo had to constantly make better games than Sega. Sega had to constantly make better games than Nintendo. That's how you were going to win. That's something to be respected. Whereas Sony kind of introduced us to a lot of those other tactics, like, well, why don't we just sell the console at a loss? Again, I don't know if they totally introduced it, but they certainly made it much more famous philosophy. People forget that since Sony doesn't actually make games, that the games that were on the console were made by a bunch of third-party developers, some of course funded by Sony, but you lose a certain sense of charm there when the guys making the console don't actually make the games on it. I'm not going to say the PlayStation introduced us to like new bonus features, because other than playing music CDs, it didn't bring anything new to the table like that, so certainly I wouldn't blame them there. But ultimately, the PlayStation 2 would prove that, like, hey, why don't we just market it as a DVD player? Once it's in the homes, then we'll make games. Sony was always kind of like that at the beginning. And I'm not necessarily sure the gaming industry is better for having had Sony involved. Certainly the technology got pushed faster, there's no doubt about that. There's no way Sega or Nintendo would have pushed technology as hard as Sony has. Not on their own. Hell, Nintendo still doesn't do that, and Sega obviously was forced to bow out. You know, so yeah, technologically hardware got a lot further with them involved, but is that better? I'm not saying it's worse, but is it better? We don't know. We don't know that alternate course of history, but to a certain extent, I kind of wish they had never been involved, because then you had an electronics company that got involved in video games, and they're not a game company. They never were. They still aren't. They certainly fund a lot of independent game studios and let them make games, but Sony is not a games company. Microsoft, also just as guilty of that, not a games company. So there's something to be said about missing the charm of two dedicated game studios going at it. And Sony introduced that logic. So and that's not to say again that the PlayStation 1 wasn't still a great console that I had a lot of amazing, great gaming experiences on that I'm sure you guys did as well. There's no denying it, man. The PlayStation 1 was a fucking fun console. It really was. Now, let's talk a little bit about the hardware, right? Okay, so this is the version that came out originally, the PS1 here. PSX as it's been dubbed by fans. Now on the back, you have the power port, you have the parallel port, you have composite ports, serial ports, multi-AV out. Now the thing with the PlayStation, and again this is something that Sony kind of did wisely, is they kept looking at the features of the PlayStation and kept going, what do we not need? Let's strip it out, let's make it cheaper to produce, because they wanted to pass the savings on to customers, and you got to give them props for that. So they would start stripping things out. Like later on they released a version, this is the same console, doesn't have the composite ports on it. They're like, ah, we don't need those, you have the multi-AV out, that's fine. Eventually they would strip out the parallel port. I'm assuming at some point they stripped out the serial port, though I'm not actually sure about that because I don't have one of those. The only function that ever came out of it was Game Shark. Now this was not officially licensed, and Sony actually really hated that these things ever came out. Every version of the PlayStation they tried their best to try and block functionality from the Game Shark. Now this first version of the console, if you've had it, and I'm sure you have because it's a very popular machine, not that well designed as far as reliability. And the reason for that was actually the way they placed the laser. It was too close to the power supply, and it actually cooks the laser over time. What that means is the thing stops reading discs. So actually there was a lot of people, myself included, who found that you had to do this with your PS1. If you did that, gravity would kind of compensate for the problem, and ultimately it would allow it to at least read the game. Some people actually had to go to the extreme going like this. I always found this method to be much more successful. Now, but Sony realized this and actually designed the PS2 accordingly. They actually made it so it was designed to stand up. Now I'm not going to say PS3 and PS4 stand up for that reason. Maybe now it's just kind of like, ooh, it looks cool when it's standing up. But that is actually why the PS2 was designed to stand up or on the side, just because they had found this problem to be such a big, widespread thing. It was kind of like the Red Rings of Death back in the day, but not quite as bad because the console would still power up and do something. But eventually, of course, they did re-release the PS1 in a smaller, more compact design, seen like this. This one is obviously very stripped down. It lacks the parallel port and stuff like that. And it basically, its intended function is it just plays the games. You know, it does have RGB SCART support, as does these versions as well, which is nice. It looks good and clean. But the other thing that made this version of the console interesting was that they included this screen in certain versions, which kind of took console gaming to a new portable kind of level, which props to them. That's a very unique idea that you could just play this on the go, a whole console like that, without it actually being like a portable handheld device, which was quite nice. Now, quickly I want to take a look at the controllers here. Now everybody kind of associates this controller as the PlayStation controller, you know, with the dual shock functionality in. Now, too often people miscredit Sony as being the first guys to have vibration in their console. It's not true. Because the PlayStation was out before the N64. Really, this controller came out after Nintendo's Rumble Pack came out for the N64. They thought, oh, that's a great idea. Can we do that? They're like, no, you know, ours don't have a port on the back. Like, well, fuck it, just re-release it with vibration built in. And of course, they put these extra sticks in there. But originally, the controller was like this. It didn't have those sticks. It was like this. And if you really look a lot at this controller, it looks very much like a Super Nintendo controller. I'm sure at first glance you don't see it because it's got these big grips there, but really the design of it really follows the Super Nintendo controller, and logically so, because it was supposed to be an add-on for the Super Nintendo. Now I want to take some time here and talk about my personal experience with this game console when I first saw it ever. Alright, so the first time I'd ever heard of this thing, it must have been 1995. My cousin had gotten one, and I went to his house one day, just, family party or whatever. And, of course, I'm used to the Super Nintendo, I'm used to the Sega Genesis. He and his friends just had this new machine. I did not recognize it, never heard of it, never seen it. And I was just like, what is that? And they're sitting there playing, I think it was Warhawk, if you remember that game. Visually, blew my fucking mind. I just couldn't believe what I was seeing. That was the first time I saw truly what the next generation was. I was just like, wow! Now, of course, that's laughable now, but at the time, damn, son, damn. Yeah, that was what I had seen. And the interesting part about that is that after I had seen that, I was just like, wow, that looks really cool. I hope I can get one of those one day. Because the way it was told to me, and I believed it because I was a kid, was that, oh, you're a kid, Sega and Nintendo, those are for you. They're child's toys. PlayStation, this is the adult time. This is when adults come in. It's got CDs. You were too young to understand CDs, blah, blah, blah. That was how it was presented to me by multiple people. So I always just kind of assumed, okay, I guess that makes sense. Because I understood that Sony made electronics. I never associated them with video games, so I understood maybe this is just what an adult game console is, even though my cousin was, of course, only a few years older than me. You're a kid, you buy shit like that. But as time went on, I was allowed to play that game console whenever I was at his house. And the game I played the shit out of the most was actually this one. This is Twisted Metal, the first Twisted Metal game. Now, in hindsight, this game itself isn't actually that great. I would always play the first level of it where you're like in an arena. I would always play that, and I could never, if I beat it, which was always amazing because I was never that good at it, I would never be able to get out into like the wider map and be able to kick ass. And for the record, for those who don't know, PlayStation games originally came in these like cardboard cases like this. And then eventually they would start coming in these cases like the Sega Saturn stuff, and then they eventually dropped that in favor of the jewel cases that we all associate more. Now, so that was how I had first seen it. And at the time, I also had a friend who had a Sega 32X. Now, more commonly, I would actually go to I knew a person who had a 32X when it was relevant. And I went to his house a lot more often, because he was only, a couple blocks away from my house. And so I would go there a lot, and we would play his 32X. But granted, we were always limited to basically Virtua Fighter. There wasn't, obviously, the 32X didn't offer you that much. But in 1995, when the PlayStation had just come out from this company, Sony, who you were like, they don't make game consoles. And then you had Sega, you're like, I love Sega, I have a Genesis. You don't really think the PlayStation is going to be the one that wins. So we're playing the 32X a lot, but more often, and I'll be straight up honest about it, as much as someone who loves Sega to death, I never found that much on the 32X to be that great. It wasn't that awesome of an experience for me. So more often than not, we would end up just popping in like Sonic the Hedgehog or something into the 32X and not really playing the 32X functionality. Now, so there came a time, it must have again been 1995, where I had convinced my mother to be like, look, the Genesis and the Super Nintendo are kind of on their way out. I'm going to need to upgrade here. My cousin's got this, my other cousins have that, my friends are starting to get these. Can I get something new here? And by this point, she wasn't just going to hand me some other, an old ColecoVision instead of her old Atari 2600 and say, oh, that'll hold you over. At this point, she kind of understood, all right, I guess we have to do an upgrade here. So she agreed to take me over to, I think it was a Toys R Us, and I went there with the fullest intention of buying a Sega 32X, because again, that's what I've been playing. And again, I just assumed, obviously falsely, that the 32X was going to have many more games on it, was going to kick some ass over time, etc. And at that point in time, obviously the Sega Saturn was already out, and I didn't even know about it. The 32X at this point it wasn't on clearance, they were still selling it at full price, but it was like a hair away from being axed. So I'm in the store, and I find the 32X. And I believe the 32X was $150. And I was ready to pull the trigger on that because, again, it's not my money. It's my mother's money at that point. And I'm just saying, like, that's what she'd agreed to. But then I look over and I see they have PlayStations. Now, I have absolutely no memory of them having Sega Saturns, which is interesting. But I saw PlayStation, and I kept thinking, like, man, I've been playing Twisted Metal a lot on that. I've had a lot of fun on that. I don't want to get a PlayStation. Now, of course, PlayStation was $300 instead of $150. So, as a kid, it's certainly hard to go to your mom and be like, "I know you're going to give me $150 for no reason just to get this thing, but you know, fuck that. Give me $300 to get this other thing." You can't do that. But so, I had to be very tactful. I basically, you know, brought her over and I said, like, "So I found it. I also see the PlayStation." And she was like, "All right." And I was like, I kind of would rather get the PlayStation, to be perfectly honest with you." And she was like, "Really? Who do you know who has a PlayStation?" Now, of course, she didn't pay any attention to what I tell her before. So I say, "Oh, you know, my cousin, you know, Mike has one." And then I started listening to some of my other friends who were actually starting to get them. And she was like, "Well, would you really rather have that than the 32X? Because you only get one." And I was like, I kind of sat there for a minute, struggled a bit, and then ultimately made the decision to get the PlayStation. And obviously, in hindsight, that was the right decision, because I had a lot of great gaming experiences on that, and the 32X was axed right after that. I mean, it couldn't have... if the Saturn was out and the PlayStation was out, the 32X could not have been around much longer than a matter of maybe a month or two. So obviously, I made the right call. But it was interesting in my childhood because it was an obvious divergence, you know, because after that, you know, I would only play the Genesis occasionally when I felt like it, you know, but I never bought more games for it really after that until I was, you know, older. And I obviously didn't pick up a Saturn, obviously didn't pick up a 32X, and I just played the PlayStation a lot. Ultimately, I would also get an N64 and play that a lot. But to me, Sega had just gone away. It had stopped being a thing. It wasn't until the Dreamcast came about where I was just like, "Oh, the Dreamcast, Sega's back, blah, blah, blah." So it was interesting to me because the PlayStation and the N64 really defined that era of my childhood, and I really love the PlayStation for that, for the gaming experiences it gave me. Not so much what it did to the industry as far as I'm concerned, but for the great gaming experiences it in of itself gave to me. And I want to talk about some of those very quickly. Now, of course, this is one of the definitive games on the console. Metal Gear Solid 1. Yeah, I think a lot of us have played this. If you haven't, you really should. Ironically, I never actually played this on the PlayStation. I always played this on the Dreamcast through the Bleemcast official release. Looks much better. It's a very, very nice release. But nevertheless, this is a PlayStation game, and it's a very good one. Silent Hill, of course, one of the best horror games like ever made. I love horror games. And this one was really, really good. I actually remember when this came out, everyone's like, "Oh, it's that shitty Resident Evil clone." Because there was a lot of them at the time, and everybody thought, "Oh, Silent Hill is going to be another one." Nope, Silent Hill was able to withstand and is still relevant now. Not as good now, but relevant now. Yeah, this is definitely one of the best games on the PlayStation in my opinion. Definitely check it out if you ever get the chance. Now this game, hands down my favorite game on the PlayStation. Twisted Metal 2. I sunk so many hours into this game, it is sick. Now I was much better at this one than I was at the first one. This is also a much better game than the first one. I played the living shit out of this, I loved it, and it broke my heart when Twisted Metal 3 by 989 Studios came out and was one of the worst games of all time. Oh, God. Twisted Metal Black was good for the PS2. The new Twisted Metal on PS3 was incredibly disappointing. This, to me, is still the game that defines this console, and I'm very happy that I got to have so many great hours of enjoyment out of it. And I know you guys want to see things like Final Fantasy VII and Lunar and just all sorts of other RPGs and of course Resident Evil and all those types of things, but those games didn't define that console for me. In fact, some of them I've never even played. And things like Resident Evil, I played the other versions. I played them on the Dreamcast and so on. So I have more games than you guys ever see in these videos. I just show you a couple of highlights or we'd be here all day. But the last one I want to show you is not a game I played the shit out of. It was actually just an interesting example. This is actually an import game. It's one of the few Japanese imports I have for the PS2, or PS1. The interesting thing about this one, which will lead me into my next point, is that it's made by Sega. Yeah, this is Puyo Puyo Sun, published, made by Sega. Now, the reason for that is that since this console was such a colossal smash hit, it actually launched in '95 and lasted so long that the Dreamcast came and went. Sega went on to being a third-party developer and actually went back to making games for this console when it was still around. Granted, they only put out 2 games. They put out this one, and the other one they put out, which I don't remember the name off the top of my head. It's a spiritual successor to Samba de Amigo. I've got it. It's an interesting game. But that just says something about the longevity of this console, man. It was around forever. It was pretty impressive. I mean, it was still getting games until like 2005, 2006, and granted at that point it was mostly sports games, but you know, they were there, and props to them for that. So yeah, that's kind of the PlayStation. You gotta give it some credit for a few things. It had very reasonably sized memory cards. Prior to that, you really had like full cartridges as memory cards, except for the Neo Geo AES all the way back in 1989 had reasonably sized memory cards. But other than that, really the PlayStation started that. Had a very standard type of controller port that they ended up putting into, of course, the PlayStation 2. And it became so widely popular that most third-party like adapters use it. Just so you can always place something, you can use a PlayStation controller on something or something on the PlayStation. I personally never really liked that controller, to be all that honest with you. I've never found it comfortable. I like the PlayStation 4 controller, but this original design, not original, but the rehash here, I never liked that design, but I didn't hate it. But yeah, there you go. That's kind of the PlayStation. That's kind of my experience with it. I enjoyed it, but in some sense, I'm not so sure it was necessarily a great thing as a whole. It would have been nice to me if the PlayStation had been just kind of a one-and-done kind of thing. Obviously, that wouldn't be financially logical to do so, but it would have been nice if this console had come, gave us some great gaming experiences, and then Sony had left voluntarily, kind of the way NEC did with the PC Engine and TurboGrafx 16. That wasn't huge here, but in Japan it was explosively successful, and then they just kind of decided, we'll fade away. That would have been nice to me, because I wasn't a huge fan of the stuff they made after that. Don't hate it, just not a huge fan. And I don't necessarily agree with all the decisions they did to the gaming industry, but whatever. Thank you very much for watching part 6 here, and please stay tuned to part 7, which will, of course, will be our final part on the Nintendo 64. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you all later.